Hey, Dog Nation, I'm Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Happy to have you with us. We continue the path of hashtag Go for Two in 22. Georgia getting back on that path again on Saturday, taking on Auburn at home. Deep South's oldest rivalry. We are talking about that today, and we're kind of talking about, I guess, the aftermath of what happened for Georgia against Missouri. And once again, an example maybe of some of the national media just kind of not quite coming down as hard on Georgia as maybe some Georgia fans expected them to. This has been now true 2 weeks in a row when Georgia's had lackluster performances, but maybe not the kind of thing that's necessarily caused people to fully reconsider everything they already thought they knew about UGA. We're going to talk about that on the show. Also, something else I'm really kind of fired up to discuss with you today. I think it's in time to kind of revisit something that UGA former great David Pollack, ESPN Game Day host, said on our show going back to last summer. At the time that he said it, it was a little bit of an eye-opening statement for me, but now, after especially the last couple of weeks, it might be time to consider the possibility that that actually might be true. I'll tell you what that is and kind of what that means here coming up in a moment. Also, a lot of times on Tuesdays, Jake Fromm is with us. Jake has a previous commitment today, so he's not going to be able to be with us today. We're going to try to catch up with him soon. So no Jake Fromm here on the show today. So we'll look forward to catching up with him very soon. But Connor Riley's going to be here. And Connor was in Athens yesterday, having a chance to talk to Georgia coach Kirby Smart and Georgia players with me in Columbia, Missouri on Saturday. So we got a lot to discuss with Connor. There's also some news as it relates to future Georgia opponents that we'll get to over the course of our time together there today. So we are going to have a good time. We're so happy to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So every now and then on DawgNation Daily, somebody will say something that really kind of stops me in my tracks, and as I'm processing it, I am forced to conclude, wow, that's really different than I expected to hear. We had one of those moments back during the summer on this show when ESPN analyst David Pollack, former UGA great, made a pretty bold claim about the Georgia defense. And at the time, I was in my mind thinking, I think we probably even said this in the show, I love David. I think David's a super smart guy. I don't necessarily agree with him on this particular point. However, it may be time to consider the possibility that David was right. Now, what was it that he was right about? Well, I'm going to get to that here coming up more on the show in just a moment. Before that, though, I want to talk about something different here. Georgia obviously returns home on Saturday to take on Auburn after another game on Saturday, this time in the SEC at Missouri, where Georgia just sort of looked a little lackluster, as we discussed yesterday. The punishment for Georgia for that is losing its number one ranking. It now drops down to number 2 in the polls. Some of the unofficial folks that kind of do their own power rankings or polls even have Georgia at number 3 behind both Alabama and Ohio State. But in the official polls, coaches and AP, Georgia now number 2, Alabama at number 1. However, beyond the fact that Georgia is just simply ranked lower than it was, you don't necessarily see a lot of folks abandoning ship on kind of what they think about Georgia as a team. And this is kind of a second consecutive week where this is true, where after the Kent State game last Saturday or 2 Saturdays ago, I think there were a lot of Georgia fans that both kind of expected the media to be pretty harsh on Georgia. I mean, kind of national media to be pretty harsh on Georgia. For the most part, it didn't really come. And after the game Saturday against Missouri, there was maybe a little bit more of that because it was another week in which Georgia didn't really look like Georgia. And certainly there was just the evaluation, well, this team can't be number 1 if it's going to play this way in consecutive Saturdays. Beyond that, there isn't necessarily this condemnation of what happened for Georgia, even though it didn't play very well against Missouri on Saturday. I want to show you an example of this from an ESPN writer. They have like these roundtable things they do where they kind of make playoff picks, and you're kind of reevaluating all that throughout the season. And one writer in particular used kind of an interesting word in terms of how he would describe what happened for Georgia against Missouri. And I think it's an important context for all of us to kind of understand about where things sort of stand with Georgia right now. So let me show this from Kyle Bonagora from ESPN. Very funny. So our producer, if you're not watching a video, this is actually pretty funny. So our producer, Michael Carvel, has a picture of Kirby Smart swinging a golf club, which is a very clever way of doing this because it kind of fits into what the what the guy says. This is funny. So Kirby swinging the golf club there. The quote is this from Kyle Bonagora. He says, Missouri came this close from throwing a major wrinkle into this whole exercise, meaning the chase for the playoff. But Georgia's ability to pull out the win preserved the status quo for another week. All of the major contenders have had at least 1 week in which their credibility was called somewhat into question, which makes it easier to give Georgia a mulligan for looking mortal. And that's why the Kirby swinging the golf club thing is pretty funny. That's very well done by Michael Carvell, our producer, on that. And most of you probably are kind of aware of what a mulligan is. It's sort of a second chance in golf. You make a bad shot, you get a free chance, kind of go back and try that shot over again. In other words, we're not going to hold this bad shot against you. And it's interesting to hear the ESPN writer describing the Georgia game against Missouri as the kind of performance that he's willing to give Georgia a mulligan for because of the reasons which he describes. And this should be understood, is that nobody in college football right now is running away from the pack. At one point in time, it sort of seemed like Georgia was because it had dominated Oregon and it had dominated South Carolina. It sort of looked like Georgia was running away from the pack. But you'll also remember this. I said on the show at the time that some of the hype that Georgia was getting around that time wasn't necessarily solely related to how Georgia was playing, but it was also related to the fact that nobody else nationally had really asserted themselves very much at all. Alabama had scuffled against Texas. Ohio State had scuffled against Notre Dame. Clemson had not really looked very good in its opening game against Georgia Tech. And for the most part, some of that stuff still kind of lingers. That, well, Georgia didn't really look like the number one team in the country on Saturday, but has anyone really consistently throughout the year looked like the number one team? Thus far, the picture as it relates to the Dogs is pretty muddy. But the picture related to Bama and Ohio State and Clemson, at one point in time, Oklahoma seemed like they might be a playoff contender. They've now lost 2 consecutive games outright on the field. USC starting to get some hype out west, but the truth is, they've had some defensive struggles, and there's really nobody that's lapping the field right now, and there's really nobody that can make a claim to having had played better, more consistently than Georgia has thus far this season. So Georgia's got its issues, and Georgia's got its stuff that it's dealing with, but no one seems to be punishing Georgia too heavily. Certainly not condemning Georgia after a couple of bad games in a row, because who else can you say that hasn't had that themselves? As I said before, all of the major contenders have sort of had their own moments in which they've dealt with that. Now that may be kind of one of the reasons in which Smart's approach these last couple of weeks, when Georgia fans have been kind of beside themselves in some cases, certainly, questioning what is that we're watching. As I said on Twitter on Saturday night, I'm ready for Georgia to look like Georgia again, and it seems like for a while here, Georgia just kind of hasn't looked like Georgia. I'm not panicked about that, but I'm just noticing it. Many of you are kind of noticing that too, but what you may also notice here is that Kirby Smart's kind of not really beside himself right now. Kirby Smart hasn't come unglued about any of this. He's certainly not, going on these epic rants about this and slamming his fist down the table. Now, what he's doing privately may be different, but what he's doing publicly is kind of casting a vision right now. And according to Smart, that while Georgia didn't play all that well against Missouri, the game itself and the conclusion of that game may have actually created an opportunity for the Dogs. So in light of the ESPN writer saying, hey, it's a mulligan for UGA, you shake it off, you move on, Kirby says, hey, maybe it's more than a shake-off moment. Maybe it's a build-from moment because of what it took to actually pull the game out. This is how Kirby Smart talked about that going back to yesterday.
Anxiety would be one of the things that you worry about with a young team. And really the first real road environment, because, the South Carolina game played out so different. We started really fast. I guess we're up 14-0, 21-0 pretty quick. And the crowd really never got into the game, took them out of the game. We didn't do that the other night. And so some of those youthful anxiety, guys playing in that kind of atmosphere for the first time, where a team, like last year's team, they would have played in that a bunch of times. So there's a lot of youth there, but to be honest with you, it was a great opportunity to see what we're about, because I don't know that you could find any greater adversity than be down 10 points in the fourth quarter, resiliency, all those things. But we got to make sure that we do a good job building on that and that we start faster and better.
So I think it's really interesting from Kirby. What we would call a bad game, Kirby calls a great opportunity. Now, some of this is just sort of posturing and kind of maybe gamesmanship within the press conference. I don't take everything that Smart says in a press conference literally, nor do I think you should either. But nonetheless, that's the tone that he's trying to strike here of, hey, we were in a tough crowd. We never got that tough crowd in South Carolina because we got up so big so soon. And while you wouldn't have wished Georgia to kind of be in a game like that where it really had to fight to win, the fact that it did have to fight to win may have actually meant something. And I can tell you this. I mentioned this on the show yesterday. That Missouri crowd went from believing that they'd rather be playing anybody but Georgia to all of a sudden thinking, hey, we may beat the number one team in the country. I mean, it became believers quickly based on the early stage of that game there on Saturday. And Smart says having been through that, that becomes a little bit of a scar tissue that you can use to your advantage in future games here this season. I find that to kind of be interesting, especially in light of an ESPN writer saying, maybe a little bit of a mulligan for Georgia. You may don't make too much of a big deal about all of this. But beyond that, that's sort of the touchy-feely stuff and sort of the, I guess, hard to define, intangible part of, what it takes to win, how you compare yourself to other elite teams. There are, though, continued specific issues in which we know that Georgia needs to work on. And while it's great that Georgia pulled out the victory against Missouri on Saturday, in terms of keeping pace with the national elite, there are just some areas in which we know Georgia's got to get better. And one of the things we talked a lot about on the show yesterday, especially with John Stinchcomb, the former Georgia All-American, is what appeared to be a really bad game for the offensive line. So with all of that kind of top of mind for Georgia fans right now, when Smart spoke during his weekly press conference yesterday, that was also a pretty big issue too. And there are a lot of different questions being asked about this group right now, including a lot of rotating where you see, Mims coming in and play right tackle, McClendon sometimes go over and play left tackle, you're rotating with the guards. You're kind of rotating offensive linemen right now throughout the first half of the season, more so than most teams kind of typically have in the past. And Smart was asked yesterday, is it time to stop doing some of that, identify your best five, and kind of go to work with those guys for the rest of the season? And once again, Smart seemed to be content to kind of keep doing what Georgia has been doing. This is Smart yesterday on the topic of that offensive line.
Now, I don't look at it as a trim up. I mean, why would you trim up your offensive line? If you have guys that play quality football and they go against pretty good players every day in practice, I think they earn the right to get an opportunity, right? Who plays at receiver? Do we play three guys? Not last time I checked. Tight end, Brock and Darnell roll in with 11 personnel. So you earn the right by how you play. And if those guys continue to earn the right and play well, then they'll probably play. It has a lot to do with conditioning and stamina. You got guys coming off injuries out there. You got guys that hadn't played a lot of football, and some guys have. So we want to play the best five, but if that's not clear, then we feel like guys that can play winning football should play. And I'm very pleased with that part of it. Can we do some better things in the run game to help them? Absolutely. Can they do a better job in the run game? Absolutely. But it's not totally on the offensive line. It never is. It's a team sport. So everybody wants to point the finger at them. They're not to blame for anything. We all got to improve.
So interesting from Kirby Smart, kind of shielding that blame from the offensive line and kind of putting it towards the entire team. And look, there's a chance that Smart's right about this. I mean, I'm not the kind of person that thinks of myself as smart enough to necessarily diagnose exactly why Georgia seems somewhat lackluster with all that there on Saturday. It just seems like the results themselves weren't quite what they needed to be. And I know there's been a lot of chatter, and Smart himself has kind of contributed to this, about the kind of blocking assignments that Georgia was giving itself, kind of shifting from more the zone-style blocking, what they call like the gap, blocking, and, you get into like, football language and, everybody, getting real serious about, football definitions on that. This is one of those things yesterday that, once again, Smart was not all that eager to pay all that much credence to about the kinds of blocking assignments that Georgia was giving itself, both late in the game when the rushing attack finally started working and the early stage of the game in which Georgia really was having a hard time kind of getting anything going at all. Once again, Smart sort of shrugging off a question that a lot of Georgia fans are asking. This is Smart again on that from yesterday.
Well, we run gap plays in every game. So if you look at the game, you see that we have every team does. Nobody really plays football anymore with just one run. There's a lot of multiple runs in there, and you can have so many runs that you can't run them all, right? The idea is to have the right ones and execute them well and do things well. But, the tape showed what we talked about the other night. We just didn't play real well up front. They had a lot of momentum, and we got to do a better job. We got to do a better job preparing our guys, but we also got to do a better job in game of making good decisions and putting ourselves in a situation to be successful, or more successful at least.
So listen, here's where I have to be very honest with you about something. I don't care that much about like zone blocking and gap schemes and stuff like that. It's obviously important. I just don't personally care about it. it's kind of like you've heard before. Like, I don't care about the birth pains. I just want to see the baby. I don't care if you're throwing a fastball or a curveball. Is it a ball or a strike? That's what I care about. So whatever, blocking schemes Georgia wants to use, they just got to do better. They don't need to run the ball more. They need to run the ball better when they do choose to run it. So Smart clearly knows more about this than I do. I'll never pretend, otherwise. But it's the results that people want to see. And Georgia has gotten a little bit of a free pass now a couple of weeks ago. They're no longer ranked number one, but most fans don't really care all that much about that. They know that Georgia's still very much alive for every end-of-season goal that it wants to have. But it does need to show improvement. And even if Smart kind of shrugs off the topic, the offensive line may be the area in which Georgia needs to show the most improvement. And so taking a step towards getting that done this Saturday against Auburn seems like a pretty good place to start. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and we're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us as we go for two in 22 and stay on that path for Georgia, maybe winning a second national championship. Obviously, there's work to be done, but as we said before, there's work to be done for everybody. Georgia's not in some sort of special category because that is true, but this Saturday against the Tigers, the hated rival that is Auburn, a good chance to kind of get some of that work done. So we're excited about all of that. By the way, speaking of doing good work, that's what our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia can do for you there as well when it comes to foundation and waterproofing issues. These are serious topics that affect you greatly. You come off a weekend which you have some rain and you have the threat of rain, and you think about that. For some of you, that's a very much anxiety-producing topic because when it rains, water's going to end up where it's not supposed to be, down in your basement or in your crawl space, in your garage, showing up and leaving evidence that it was there. Those wet spots, that dampness, that extra moisture that doesn't quite feel right. All about that. Or maybe for you, it's more like the cracks that show up in the walls and are there. And you try to pretend that you don't see them, but you obviously do. And that can be the sign of a foundation issue. And listen, the foundation of your home is literally supporting the thing that supports you. For most of us, our home is not just our greatest financial asset, but it's also kind of like the source of all of our comfort and memories and things like that. It is literally the center of our lives. And so protecting it and making sure that it's well taken care of is of paramount importance. That's why Engineered Solutions of Georgia is such a great resource for you. If you've got waterproofing issues, if you've got foundation issues, they can come to work for you. After all, the word solutions is right there in their name. They are a solutions-based company. That means they can provide a simple fix for you for smaller issues or a more substantial fix when the job requires that there as well. They've got an entire team of engineers on staff. There's nobody else in the market that can say that for you, putting that kind of resource available to you to do the work that needs to be done. That's what they're capable of. They're also proud partners of UGA. It's fun to support those that support the dogs. It's important for me to certainly say thank you to all of you who support those who've been such good friends of ours and for a long time. That's exactly what Engineered Solutions of Georgia has been. In fact, they've been with us for such a long time, you probably already know their phone number. It's 678-ESOG-NOW. That's 678-ESOG-NOW. That's the number to dial to get in touch with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, we're going to get Connor Riley coming up in just a moment. Looking forward to talking to him. It's normally Jake Fromm here on Tuesday. Jake had a previous commitment today, not going to be with us, but we'll try to catch up with Jake again very soon. If not, we'll see him again next week. But always a lot of fun with Jake. Today, though, Connor Riley back in a traditional spot for him early in the show on Tuesday. A lot to break down with Connor, including the comings and goings with the offensive line and what you want to see this Saturday against Auburn. We'll do a lot of that with Connor here coming up in just a little bit. Before that, though, let's go around the doghouse. And it's presented today by our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. I mentioned this off the top of the show. This past summer, there was something said on our show that kind of got me stopped in my tracks here for a moment. David Pollack, who was a great analyst and obviously a great former player at Georgia, as true a version of a DGD as there ever could be, was on the show, and he was laying out in very realistic terms kind of what he saw from Georgia in its national championship season. He called it the greatest front seven he'd ever seen as someone who's been around football his entire life. And in looking ahead, at the time we were looking ahead to the start of the 2022 season, gave you a very sober assessment of what he thought that meant for Georgia here this season. And he put it in statistical terms. And at the time, I didn't believe him. At the time, I thought he was probably exaggerating the degree to which that Georgia might be missing some of the big names that it lost off last year's unit. But after the last couple of weeks, it might be appropriate to consider the possibility that David may have been right back then, and what it means if he was. This is what David said this summer about what he expected from this version of the Georgia defense. Here's a reminder from our show.
This defense is going to be at least 10 points a game worse than it was a year ago. Okay? That sounds horrible, Brandon. That sounds terrible. They'll still be in the top 30 in scoring defenses in the country. Like, they're still going to be really good, but you're going from historic good, historic great, 5 guys drafted in the first round. That doesn't even count in the Kobe Dean. So, I mean, you're just talking about you're going from super special to something that's going to be different. But who's your leading sack guy? You got Beal back. You got Nolan Smith, who I think is your heartbeat. The best defensive player on the team is Jalen Carter to me. So he's coming back next year. So you've got a lot of pieces to be very successful. Yes, they're going to have to be aggressive. Yes, you're going to have to continue to get the quarterback, and that's something that group I think did prove they could do really, really well at a high level, which sets you apart from many defenses of Georgia's defensive past. But again, they're going to take a significant step back, but they're still going to be really solid.
So that's really interesting. There's a lot that David says there that I want to revisit here. But how about the original point, though, that he believes, he said at the time, this Georgia defense, the one in 2022, that at the time that he was saying that, we hadn't seen this team on the field yet, it was going to allow 10 more points per game than Georgia allowed a year ago. Georgia only averaged about 10 points allowed per game a year ago. And after the first few games, it seemed like David may have exaggerated the degree to which Georgia was going to miss the 5 first-round picks off last year's team. Georgia only gave up 3 points to Oregon, and Oregon was lucky to score those. Georgia shut out Samford and only gave up 7 points on the road to South Carolina. This is a team that wasn't really yielding anything at all in terms of points, and a lot about this Georgia defense felt pretty similar to the way that it felt a year ago. But since then, 2 consecutive Saturdays, Georgia's allowed 22 points in each of those games. It's sort of strange because it's a little bit of a strange football score. But nonetheless, in back-to-back weeks, Georgia has given up 22 points with its defense. And you're left to wonder, is this more of what we're going to see later on this year, where all of a sudden Georgia is kind of seeing its opponent get into the 20s far more than it did a year ago? And if that's the case, well, what do you do about that? I believe the answer on this is clear. And David Pollack actually said this in the clip. You got to be aggressive. You got to go out there and do something on your own defensively to negate the fact that opposing offenses may be about to get more against you than you're used to giving up. First 3 games of the season didn't seem like that was the case. Last 2 games of the season against pretty mediocre competition, Georgia's allowed 22 points each in both of those games. You're going to have to do something to counterbalance all that, I believe. And actually, I don't think you have to look any further than last Saturday's game as proof of this. Not for what was happening on the Georgia side of things, but what was happening on the Missouri side of things there as well. Because the overall numbers for Georgia on Saturday offensively, they actually look okay. The total yardage, even the rushing yards we've kind of talked about, some of those end-of-game totals actually don't seem all that bad. But why does it seem like Georgia was struggling during the game if the actual stats from the game don't look all that unimpressive? I think it's because of the way in which Missouri played Georgia. And Kirby Smart himself talked about this. He was asked, hey, what'd you see from the Missouri defense against your guys there on Saturday? And what Smart said about Missouri, even though Missouri is nowhere near as good as UGA, what Smart said about Missouri is what I, as a fan, wish that people would say about Georgia. That when you're giving up more than you're used to, what do you do to counterbalance that? Well, here's what Smart said he saw the Missouri Tigers defense doing on Saturday. This is Kirby from Saturday night.
Disruptive. I mean, they just attack the line of scrimmage, and you got to make them pay for it, usually on the perimeter. There's a lot of, I wouldn't call them unsound, but not worried about the pass, and they're really aggressive, and they make up for it by getting hits on your quarterback. They timed up a lot of good pressures. The Hopper kid from Georgia played really well for them and made some plays, and they did a good job.
I mean, listen to the words that Smart uses there. He says they were disruptive, they were attacking, they were aggressive, they were hitting the quarterback, they were creating pressure. And Smart also says they were taking some chances to do that. But if you're not going to just line up and maul people defensively on a per-play basis, what other choice do you have? This is ultimately why even though the overall stats for Georgia looked pretty impressive. Stetson Bennett had more than 300 yards passing. This is why it actually seemed like it was a far better performance for Missouri defensively than maybe the overall number suggested. They had 2 sacks. They had 9 tackles for loss. So sometimes when Georgia was gaining big yardage, all they were doing was gaining back the yardage they lost in the previous play. That Missouri's willingness to take risks defensively actually worked for it on Saturday. And going forward, we expect Georgia obviously to be a much better defense than Missouri. But from a playing personality standpoint, I honestly wouldn't mind it if Georgia mirrored that personality a little bit more. If David Pollock was right in the last 2 weeks, suggested he might be, and that Georgia, instead of giving up 10 points per game, is going to have more games in which they're giving up like 20 or more points, then you're going to have to do something to mitigate what you're giving up. You're going to have to do something to counterbalance that. You're going to have to negate that. Well, negative plays, that's what negating means. You're going to have to create more sacks. You're going to have to create more tackles for loss. You're going to have to commit yourself to being a pressure-packed defense. This is something that Dan Lanning, I believe, was very good in instilling in Georgia the last 2 years. Not just 2021, but go back and watch the per-game stuff back in 2020. Yes, it was a short season, and yes, overall, it was probably the worst defense of the Kirby Smart era at Georgia. But Azeez Ojulari had a great pass rush year. Georgia, in general, had a very aggressive defense. Go back and watch the Cincinnati game. Georgia doesn't win that game that day without a great pressure defense in the backfield against Desmond Ridder and that Bearcats team all day long. That was the playing personality that Georgia kind of demonstrated, not just in the national championship year, but in the year before that as well, and what otherwise might be a little bit of a forgotten season. And in the post-Dan Lanning era, I think that's the responsibility of this Georgia defense right now. Can you commit yourself to pressure? Can you commit yourself to creating negative plays? Because if you don't, you create an opportunity where opposing offenses can just have a little more success against you than you're used to seeing them have. So something to consider there. It's Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. And we're, of course, happy to have them on the show. And I was traveling around a bunch this past weekend, a lot of you doing a lot of that same kind of stuff. And when you do, obviously, one of the great things to take with you anywhere you go is from our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. It's that Visa Signature Platinum card, because the stuff that you're already buying, the experience of buying it, the purchases that you're making, made more enjoyable when you use the Visa Signature and Platinum card. First of all, there's all kinds of conveniences associated with it. You can make contactless payments, which is kind of a nice thing, but you get great incentives for using the card there as well. You get flex rewards, which can be used for just about anything: gift cards, cash back, travel, merchandise, so much more. You can also earn up to $150 when you even open your Visa Signature, Platinum, or Signature card account. And there are some restrictions that apply, so you want to check out the website for more information on this. Visit georgiasown.org for complete details. That's georgiasown.org for a lot more on that. All right, so we got a lot to do on the show here today. Before we're done, there's some new movement with one of Georgia's future opponents that I think is worth considering here as we kind of think about what the rest of the season looks like for these Dogs. We will get to that. But for now, aftermath of the game against Missouri, looking ahead to the game against Auburn, great to have Connor Riley with us as a part of a Kroger Fresh Take here on DawgNation Daily today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We will say hello to Connor Riley here, Kroger Fresh Take with him. And Connor, let me begin kind of where I began the show today, where I think for a second consecutive week, even though Georgia has now lost its number one ranking, I don't think you see wide condemnation of Georgia. Now, certainly Georgia fans are ready to see their team play better, and I'll put myself in that group there too. You're kind of ready to see Georgia look like Georgia again. But people kind of, sort of forgave Georgia for the rough performance against Kent State, and even the game against Missouri, there's this thought of, well, everybody's played bad at least once so far this year. And, Georgia obviously still has its end-of-season goals intact, and most people are still treating them like the same level of championship contender they were before that. They've clearly got to play better, but it's not like very many prominent voices are saying that they can't or won't simply because they didn't there on Saturday. Is that also the sense that you get of this, which is that it's not that much fun for Georgia fans to see their team kind of scuffling here the last little bit compared to the expectation we have for them, but it's also not the thing that really anyone seems to have condemned them for, at least for right now?
Yeah, I think the swing in terms of what this Georgia team has been, their A game is clearly, I think, the best game in the country right now. But the last 2 weeks, we haven't seen that. I think Kent State was a C performance, and I think, quite frankly, Missouri was a D performance if you even give those out still. And so I think, the fact that you've seen those wild fluctuations in terms of what this team has been, I can understand where Georgia fans are frustrated by that. But then from the national media standpoint, I think there's still probably a bet on what Georgia is going to be on a week-in, week-out basis to where they'll believe in. We've seen this team at their best. We believe they'll be closer to their best than what you've necessarily seen in these last 2 weeks.
I think that's really interesting, and obviously we've talked a lot about offensive line. Kirby Smart talked about it a good bit yesterday, and this is one of those things where it's like using gap scheme, using zone. I sort of don't care. I just want to see it work, right? It's like the big cat figured out meme. It's like whatever strategy you want to use, just figure it out and just let it just do something that works. And so, where do you think things stand with the offensive line right now? Attention being paid to the rotations, attention being paid to the kinds of blocking assignments the players are given, and also attention justifiably being paid to what I think right now are a little bit of a lack of results. What do you make of the situation with the offensive line, which seems to be the group in the biggest spotlight after the game against Missouri from Saturday?
Yeah, so on the rotations, Kirby was asked about this yesterday, and I think he kind of gets annoyed when you ask him about offensive line rotations based on his answer. But if you go back and look at the snap counts, we talked so much about rotating guys in. Amarius Mims, Devin Willock, I think are the two big ones. Those guys only played 6 snaps on Saturday. Those guys were not being rotated in with the same frequency that they had been in the first 4 games of the season. So most of that game, you're pretty much looking at your starting 5 in terms of Trusson, Ratledge at the guards, obviously Cedric Von Prawn at center, and then Warren McClendon and Broderick Jones at your tackle spots. And I'll be interested to see this week if that continues once again. I know Kirby has downplayed it, and obviously Kirby knows a lot more about football than I do. But I just think there's something to be said about the offensive line and playing the same 5 guys all the time and having that consistency to where, early in the year, I understand Kirby Smart wanting to build depth because as we saw last year, you're going to have injuries on the offensive line. And so, if you have guys that you're able to get key snaps for early on in the season and able to move around in the event that something bad happens with an injury situation on the offensive line, you're in a good spot there. But as we get into the real meat of Georgia's schedule here, I think you want to be able to play your best 5 guys and have guys that you can count on. And so I'll be interested in seeing, Tate Ratledge, because, and you and I touched on this in the press box on Saturday night, Tate Ratledge has not played a lot of college football, and I know a lot of people had really high expectations for him, but he essentially had only played 4 snaps of any consequence in his first 2 years at Georgia, and with him being rotated in and out and around, he has not, I think, been the player that I think a lot of people thought he was going to be at this point in time. And so I actually think him playing more snaps, I think, is going to give him a better chance to continue to get better because maybe unlike, say, a Xavier Truss or even a Warren McClendon, he's so green in terms of the snaps in the big games that he's played that getting him more snaps in particular, because right now I do think he's the weak link on this offensive line, if they can just get him more snaps and get him more football experience, I think that's going to potentially help cure up some of the issues that we've seen with this offensive line.
I talked about the Georgia defense before you joined us here a moment ago, and I know this may sound weird, but I almost wish Georgia was playing more like Missouri. I don't mean results because Georgia's still better defensively than Missouri is, but Missouri had 9 tackles for loss on Saturday. They had 2 sacks, and that's one of the reasons why, even though the overall numbers for Georgia don't look that bad, Stetson Bennett had 300 yards passing, and even the rushing numbers aren't necessarily as bad as you think they might be. It seems like it was a better day for the Missouri defense than maybe by appearances it should have been because they were so aggressive. They were in the backfield. They were making those impactful negative plays. And I played some audio of David Pollack from our show in the summer when he said, hey, this is a Georgia team that's going to give up 10 more points per game than it gave up a year ago. Well, after the first 3 games, that seemed ridiculous. Well, after the last 2, they've been in the 20s both times in terms of points allowed. And if that's going to be more of the norm here moving forward, Connor, I don't see any other choice here but to kind of dial up the pressure. Whether that means getting a guy like Marvin Jones ready to play or being clever in how you're deploying other guys, finishing sacks when you have an opportunity to do. That's something that Nolan Smith just missed out on Saturday. But one way or another, you got to start getting quarterbacks on the ground and you got to start getting more plays in the backfield because this may be a Georgia defense that's just allowing more on a per-play basis than we saw in 2021.
Well, I mean, that was always going to be the case, and I would push back there a little bit in saying that some of those points that Georgia defense gave up, especially in the last 2 weeks, was not because of anything they did, but because the offense gifted the ball to the opposing
Fair enough.
team on that Georgia defensive side of the field there. If you obviously you can't take away turnovers, but I believe in the last 2 weeks, 6 of those points in each game were directly because of turnovers in that short side of the field. So, if this team's giving up 16 points a game as opposed to 22, I'm not sure how much we're talking about this. But I will say, Georgia only played 2 outside linebackers on Saturday. Jalen Carter's only played 8 snaps in the second half all season. They're not necessarily getting, I think, their best guys on the field enough to pressure in the way that I think you and a lot of other people want to see them do that. And they only bring 4 outside linebackers with them to Columbia. That was a noticeable change from what they've done in the past there. And so I'll be interested. I don't necessarily know right now if they have the personnel to be that attacking defense, especially just given some of the injuries that they've been dealing with. Snow Munden was dealing with a sprained ankle. Tresman Marshall is just always going to have a long-term knee issue there. And so they're not super-duper healthy right now in that front 7. And so I think they're trying to manage who can go out there and who can play and sort of patchwork what they can do. And so because they're only playing so few guys on that front anyway, they're limiting the way they can go about attacking because they're just not as deep as a defense as they were a season ago.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and certainly they've been punished by, as you said, excessively short fields, and that's all true. I'd also point out in the Oregon game, they also gave up a lot of yards too. They allowed fewer points, and the yards they yielded suggest they probably should. So some of this kind of stuff sort of works out in the wash maybe a little bit as well.
Well, I think by the end of the game, Oregon had only had like 320 total yards of offense there, and that's only 30 more than what they gave up on Saturday. But I largely see your point there. And red zone defense, I would note, probably has been a strength of this Georgia team so far this season. And so if you are looking at some encouraging long-term trends, that is probably one area that you would circle in. This team has not given up a lot of touchdowns on the season so far, and that is a big reason why they're able to win on Saturday against Missouri.
I want to ask you a big picture question here in a moment. Let me remind folks before that, though, this is our Kroger Fresh Day with Connor Riley here today. And, of course, as you start thinking about this month of October that we're in, you start thinking about scary Halloween savings with our friends at Kroger. It's actually not scary at all. It's actually something really fun to consider. The decor you need, the candy you need, all the stuff to make your house the epicenter for Halloween in your neighborhood. Right there at your local Kroger, you can get that. Just stop by in store and see them, or check them out at Kroger.com/Halloween for more on that. It's Kroger.com/Halloween for a lot more on that. So, Connor, I'm curious your thoughts on this. I don't know that my big picture perspective of Georgia has changed all that much. I still think that the road games it plays late in the season, Mississippi State, Kentucky, are challenging road games, but I've sort of always thought that. I know there's a little bit of buzz around Tennessee right now, but the truth is Tennessee is at least as good as I thought they've been. If anything, they've actually probably underperformed compared to expectations here a little bit. I still don't see this imminent challenge to Georgia in the SEC East. Tennessee may win at LSU on Saturday. If that does happen, that actually doesn't mean all that much to me necessarily. That this is still a Georgia team that's not really going to be, I believe, competed with within the SEC East, and still a Georgia team that kind of only measures itself against the elite teams in the country, and Alabama and Ohio State, teams like that. Yes, the last couple of weeks suggest that Georgia's got stuff to work on, but the overall outlook I've had for the entirety of the season hasn't really been altered. Is that true for you?
No, I still think this is a team that's going to win a national championship this season, and I said as much before the season, and I still haven't seen anything, to deter us from that. I think if this team gets Jalen Carter back healthy, which I expect to be, at best in that Florida game, but probably maybe even more that Tennessee game, I think that's going to add an important layer to this defense. As I think guys like Shmuel Munden and Jamon Dumas-Johnson are going to continue to take steps forward, and I'm really interested in this week in seeing what A.D. Mitchell and Arian Smith bring back to this offense. I think Don Blaylock made some nice plays in a limited role on Saturday. I would like to see him get more involved with this offense going forward, just given what his skill set is. And if you're able to add dynamic outside receivers in Arian Smith and A.D. Mitchell to this offense, I do think that's going to help open things up, because watching that Missouri game on Saturday, Georgia just really didn't have a guy on the outside that was able to get really any consistent separation. And so when you're constantly having to scheme receivers open, that allows safeties to creep up. I don't think they're going to be allowed to do that if you have Arian Smith and A.D. Mitchell on the field. And so having those guys and having their presence is just going to open up everything else, I think, for this offense in some of the areas that we've seen them struggle. They didn't exactly create a lot of big explosive plays on Saturday. having an Arian Smith to stretch the field is going to open things up in the middle of the field for guys like Darnell Washington and Brock Bowers, who I think right now are pretty clearly your best receivers. And also, that's, I think, at some point going to help the running game is having those deep threats on the outside to allow, maybe not the in-the-middle rushing, but at least some of the outside stuff that we saw have some success on Saturday against Missouri.
So quick final point here. You mentioned Bowers and Washington. I have been adamant that they are not throwing the ball to Bowers nearly enough for my taste. He's just so far and away the best player on this offense that he's got to be utilized more like that. And when I say that, there are also some fans that say, in BA, you got to include Darnell Washington in that conversation there too. It's obvious that Washington's a very good player and a very important part of this offense. And, one of the things you and I were talking about a little bit, kind of traveling back from Missouri on Saturday, is why does it seem like there is a little bit of a ceiling on how many touches he gets per game? We've seen Bowers get 5 and 6 catches with regularity. We've even seen him have double-digit catches in a game before. With Washington, it seems more like it's the 2 or 3 catch type game, which seems to kind of top him out here right now. Why do you think that is, Connor? Do you have an opinion on why Washington continues to be so valuable, but clearly not as many touches as maybe some fans would like for him to have?
I mean, the biggest thing might be just plays on the field. Darnell Washington plays a lot. I believe among Georgia skill players, he was, I think, 4th in terms of snaps played, but he played 47 snaps against Missouri on Saturday. Brock Bowers played 71. He's just on the field a lot more than Darnell Washington is. And availability is the best ability. And obviously, Darnell deserves praise for the player that he has become and his ability to improve his physicality in terms of conditioning to be on the field that much. But, Bowers has pretty much throughout his entire career been, from day one, a guy that is capable playing a ton of snaps, and so because of that, I think that's just the availability of Bowers being out there on the field is what allows him, I believe, to separate from Darnell Washington. But to your other point on Bowers, I think you're absolutely right. He's had 5 receptions in the last 3 games. I think you've got to find a way to get him 8, 9, 10 targets a game and really just put the ball in his hands and find a way to create mismatches, because we even saw late in the game there on Saturday, so many of the struggles that they had in the red zone were because they weren't winning on first down. Well, the last touchdown drive, they find Brock Bowers for a little screen pass, and he takes it all the way to the 1-inch line and allows Dejon Edwards to bury it on the next play. There's no reason, in my opinion, that they can't do that maybe 2 or 3 more times again. I'm not saying you have to get Brock Bowers double-digit catches in every single game, because I think that's a way for him to sort of wear out and have essentially a Jameson Williams type injury at the end of the season due to overusage. But I do think that Georgia can get him, say, 2 to 3 more touches over the course of the game right now than what we have necessarily seen these past couple of weeks, especially when it's a close game. It's one thing, when it's a South Carolina game and you're blowing them out and it's pretty much over at halftime. I think you're more okay with him ending up in the 5-touch range, 6-touch range in those games. But in a close game, like even we saw last year against Alabama, there's nobody in college football that can cover this guy. And I do think I think Georgia would behoove itself to find ways to get Brock Bowers from, say, 5 touches a game to 8 or 9 touches a game.
Connor, great stuff. Totally agree. Thanks for your perspective on that. As a part of our Kroger Fresh Take today, we'll look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So very pleasant surprise to announce. I told you earlier that Jake Fromm not going to be able to join us today. He was previous commitment he's taken care of. But guess what? Jake Fromm now says that he can pop on here for a couple of minutes. We won't be able to keep him long. He's very busy today. But about 7 minutes from right now, we will talk to Jake Fromm here on the show today and get some thoughts from him about what he saw from the game against Missouri and how you kind of move on from that. We'll do that with Jake here in just a couple of minutes. Before that, though, cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Great time to be thinking about a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, specifically our DawgNation cruise coming up. April 24th, we're leaving out of Port Canaveral on Independence of the Seas. Going to be going to Nassau, great port right there in the Bahamas, and Perfect Day, Coco Cay. And I got to tell you, the thing that sets a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation apart, you could point to a lot of different things. The entertainment on board the ship, the specialty dining, the live entertainment while you're in there, the Broadway-style shows, all that kind of stuff. But for me, the big differentiator, which is a bigger word than I should probably be using, the big thing that sets Royal Caribbean apart is that great experience, that private island oasis, which is Perfect Day Coco Cay. And we're going there on Independence of the Seas this April, and we want to take you with us when we do. So check out RoyalDogs.com. That's the website specially built by Jessica Slater, the travel agent who was specially selected by Royal Caribbean to help us book our Dog Nation cruise. She's got the website for you, RoyalDogs.com. You can find out all the information you need, and then you can give her a call at 770-718-9147, 770-718-9147. If you've just got questions, she can help answer those questions for you, or if you're ready to book and be with me on board Independence of the Seas this April, we're glad to have you there for that. Royal Caribbean going to be a great, great time, and we can't wait to see you there for that. All right, a couple of things here before we bring on Jake Fromm here, coming up in about 5 minutes' time. So our Mississippi State, we didn't talk about this yesterday, but after blasting Texas A&M, has now entered the top 25 in both polls. And they were actually already favored against A&M last week, who was a top 25 team. So Mississippi State was probably already one of the 25 best teams in the country. Now they get the poll designation, befitting that. Mike Leach was asked about this yesterday and kind of, shrugged off the whole thing. He doesn't really care about that. But I do think it becomes another way of reframing the game that Georgia's going to play there later on in November. We've said over and over, for us, the games worth circling for Georgia, not necessarily Florida, because we don't think Florida's all that good. The Tennessee game, this is still a home game for Georgia against a team that it really dominated last year. Don't expect Tennessee to be a huge threat to Georgia when those two teams play. I know the Vols are getting a little bit of hype right now. That's not something I buy into all that much. I think Tennessee's good, but we thought they were good already. My overall opinion about Georgia compared to Tennessee has not really changed very much. But at Mississippi State, could be a challenge. And it's the kind of thing that was kind of always true, but now when you say it out loud, on the road against an SEC team ranked in the top 25, assuming the Mississippi State Bulldogs are still there when this game is played, now you get a little bit more of a sense of exactly what Georgia's facing there that day. The Kentucky game around that same time is a little bit that same type of vibe, but Mississippi State has been one of the more impressive teams thus far this season. They get Arkansas on Saturday. That's a must-win for the Hogs. It's another chance for Mississippi State. That's actually a pretty fun one in the SEC West on Saturday for a future Georgia opponent. The big game in the SEC this week, drama on both sides for A&M and for Alabama. Now, obviously the one thing that everybody has said is when we first looked ahead like October the 8th, it was a date everybody had circled because what this game would be like, and as it stands right now, there's not quite as much circling on this anymore, just simply because of the fact that A&M has turned out not to be very good. But yet the lingering controversy in the summer still kind of looms here a little bit. The stuff that Jimbo basically said about Saban, calling him a narcissist, mocking him by calling him God. Well, now Jimbo says, we're all good. That's all in the past. And I'm sure it probably is. Two guys let their temper just sort of get the best of them there for a moment. But what a terrible time for A&M to be playing a game like this, because Alabama will be extra motivated, not just because of what Jimbo said, but also because of the fact this is a team that Alabama lost to last year. And for A&M, that has been so bad that Jimbo Fisher has even had his $100 million contract called into question here. I just think it's the wrong time to be playing Alabama, even if Alabama does not have Bryce Young. Now, speaking of that, kind of a growing chatter around the Bama program related to Bryce Young and the fact that Nick Saban is both pushing back on the media because they want to know how they're going to use Jalen Milroe and kind of want to know what Bryce Young's status is. And this is where I think you could see some frustration start to kind of bubble in here for Saban. We don't really quite know, exactly how hurt Bryce Young is. Saban's kind of shrugging it off, making it sound like it's not necessarily that serious of a deal. But for Bryce Young, you've got a lot to think about with your future here. And it'll be interesting to see if he actually comes back and plays again as quickly as Nick Saban is almost intimating that he might be able to. So you could have some drama related to that there at Alabama. But one thing we do know is, won't see Bryce Young on Saturday when Texas A&M comes to call. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, we're going to get ready to welcome in the great former Georgia quarterback. He had the day off today, was not supposed to be with us, had some business he was taking care of, but he's going to join us right now anyway. Courtesy of our friends at Kroger, it's Jake Fromm joining us here on DawgNation Daily here today. Jake, I know you're busy. I know you got a lot going on. Thanks for stopping by and talking some Georgia football with us here today.
Hey, Brandon. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you for having me again, and let's get right to it, brother.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I know you know what it feels like to be on the road in the SEC. That crowd starts breathing down your neck. How did you think Georgia responded to that on Saturday? A game that ended up being closer than it was supposed to be, but Georgia ultimately ended up winning. What was your evaluation of what you saw from UGA?
Yeah, so obviously it wasn't pretty. It's not wasn't necessarily the product we were expecting them to put out. Obviously, it is very tough going on the road in the SEC in a big-time football game. They just got behind the sticks early in the first half, a lot of second and longs, and the turnovers. And so anytime you give a team an opportunity to hang around with turnovers, it's just going to be it's going to be a battle. But what was great to see, we saw that say, what was great to see, though, was late in the game, them fight, come back, and to win a football game there at the end. It's very, very good, very promising to see, and it's really good to know they got a little fight in them.
So in the early stage of the game, especially the first half, it seemed like the passing game was having a hard time getting going. Ultimately, the Bennett numbers ended up looking pretty good. He throws for more than 300 yards, but there were times in which it didn't really look like receivers were getting open, maybe not creating that separation you want to see, and maybe Stetson could have been a little bit more accurate on a couple of the throws that he made. Specifically with that part of it, what were you seeing from the Georgia passing game on Saturday where Missouri seemed to have some success kind of going into a pretty aggressive form of man coverage, and for a while it seemed like Georgia was having a hard time making them pay for that?
Yes, so they did a really good job of bringing pressure and then mixing up those pressures. And so with pressure here and there, they got a lot of one-on-ones. The pressure was getting Stetson a little bit. Had to find different answers, different quicker answers. And so they could, because they did such a great job of bringing pressure and then mixing up that pressure, it was really hard for the offense, especially in the passing game, to find a rhythm. The quick underneath balls weren't really there because, like you said, the man coverage was there. So nothing was really easy. Nothing was really given to them. Kudos off to Missouri for coming in with a great plan, sticking to it, and executing on that plan.
And one of the things I've said a lot, Jake, and I'll be the first to admit, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about here, but when it comes to a guy like Brock Bowers, who I think is pretty clearly the elite player in this offense right now, he's the one guy that seems very likely to be a future NFL first-round pick. And he had 5 catches or so on Saturday, but it seems like to me, when your offense is struggling, that would be a guy you want to lean into even more. What is the process like for you as a quarterback of, how do you make sure a guy like that gets the football enough? And I guess, is that easier said than done when it comes to the fact that the defense sort of knows that too, maybe?
Yeah, it's a combination of a lot of things. It's the plan early in the week, and then, you could have the best plan all week, and then Missouri comes out and there's a slightly different scheme. Okay, maybe that plan's out the window, and then, even if it is a great plan, you still have to go out and execute on that plan. For Brock to get the football in the passing game, Stetson has to, one, deliver a good ball. We have to block with the offensive line. Maybe, they bring pressure, so now running back gets to stay in, and now he has to block somebody. So there's a lot of different things happening. I still am going to go back to Missouri did a really good job of bringing pressure. Stetson, I don't think ever really got comfortable there in the first half throwing the football. And they just could not find a rhythm because they did a really good job with the pressure. Fast
forward to this week, it's an Auburn opponent you know well. Some of your, I think, most memorable games maybe it came against Auburn, 2017 SEC championship game, home win in 2018, obviously hard-fought game that you won the division there in 2019. How I guess maybe advantageous is it to have a game like this where it's easy to get up for Auburn after a couple of weeks of lackluster play? All of a sudden you look across the field, you see a hated rival. Do you think that brings some extra juice in a game like this on Saturday?
Yeah, I hope it finds a more consistent juice. I think these last couple games have showed them that they can't just flip the switch on. Yes, they're a really good football team. Yes, they have all the potential to be the best football team in the country, but you just cannot flip a switch and decide when you want to be the best team in the country. So I think it's just going to be a test this week of kind of getting out of that funk a little bit and showing up and playing some hard-nosed football, winning the battle in the trenches, letting everything else take care of itself and protecting the football.
And, of course, I guess a little bit of a different feeling on the Fromm family side of this with your brother over there now. I guess the Georgia-Auburn game probably feels a little different in the Fromm household than it used to, I guess.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I mean, there's always something special about playing Auburn because of that. It's a really fun time for myself, obviously my family and everything. So we enjoy it. It's a fun time for us, and for me, this time I just kind of get to sit back, relax, and enjoy it.
That's great stuff. Jake, I know you're busy. Thanks for being with us here today. We'll look forward to getting a chance to talk to you soon. Your perspective on Georgia football, always so valuable for us.
Yes, Yes, sir. Thank you, Brendan.
Good stuff there from Jake Fromm here on the program today. He knows what it feels like to be Stetson Bennett in a game like this. And, he says, hey, that pressure, makes you a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe makes you, the decisions you want to make, maybe you're not able to make those as, I guess, unencumbered as you'd like to be able to. I think that's a pretty interesting perspective from Jake Fromm there on a day in which we weren't expecting Jake to be able to be with us. He says, hey, I got some free time. I'm going to pop on here. I want to talk some Georgia football. That's Jake's commitment. And you love that from him as a part of our show here today. And by the way, speaking of great commitments, that's what the Durham Law Group also has for you there as well. They're committed to you when you've been hurt or injured on the job in an accident, situation like that. They want to make sure you're made whole and fully compensated for the damage that's been done to you. When it comes to this kind of personal injury law practice, they don't just practice law, they define it. That means that there's no fees or expenses for you unless you win. That's how hard they want to be able to work for you to really make you whole again, to make you right again, and to go to bat for you, make sure you get what you deserve. So you can contact them for more information at 844-4GA-HURT. That's 844-4GA-HURT. You can also find them online at georgiahurt.com. That's georgiahurt.com for a lot more on that. And as we kind of roll through the week, one of the things we're going to be doing a lot more of is talking about this Georgia-Auburn rivalry. As I said before, for a guy like Jake Fromm, this is a legacy-defining kind of series for him. Big SEC championship win. Well, I'll remember the 2018 game. You'll remember that as the game in which, I didn't bring this up to Jake, but when Kirby kind of faked the field goal and made Gus Malzahn so mad. But it was kind of a reminder of, the intensity of that rivalry, the HBTFD game after the 2019. There's a lot to this. We talked about John Stinchcomb yesterday and the great speech that he gave at the end, or I should say at halftime in 2002, a game in which Georgia had a chance to win the division, something they had not done in program history up to that point in time. Got down a couple of touchdowns early, fought back, and a lot of folks will kind of tell you, hey, it's what happened in halftime that day that helped propel Georgia to that victory. There are tons of memories about what has made this rivalry special, and when we think about that, it's one of the things that makes the Deep South's oldest rivalry so much fun for UGA fans. And it's also a great opportunity as well to support your university here this week there, too. There's a great kind of competition, good-natured, friendly competition going on between the UGA Athletic Association and the body that kind of represents Auburn on this, too. What we're calling this is Beat Week. It's a chance for UGA grads, those that love supporting UGA, to make donations and beat Auburn, not just on the football field on Saturday, but in the donation space there as well. It'll be Georgia's chance to maybe get a third consecutive Beat Week win over Auburn, and you love that streak kind of growing at the same rate. The streak on the field is growing there as well. So every time somebody steps up and donates, that gets Georgia one step closer to being able to do all of this again. Of course, we love the work that the UGA Alumni Association is doing, making dog fans feel connected to their university no matter where they live, but also kind of raising the money that allows the University of Georgia to continue to be such a beacon in our state, kind of pointing the way towards a great future, both in terms of the folks that it's educating, but the research that it's doing to help us understand complicated problems in the world. That is really what UGA is all about. And so it's always a great time to support the University of Georgia on this, but it's especially a good time to do that here right now when you get a chance to actually beat Auburn in the process. So that's what Beat Week is all about. So make sure you step up and do that. Donate to the UGA Alumni Association here this week. Let's beat Auburn both on the field and when it comes to donations, and continue to support the great work that the UGA Alumni Association is doing, providing its own support to the University of Georgia. As we sign off here today, our golden shoe kind of comes outside the typical space today, but I just thought this video was too amazing not to show. You've seen this a million times now. So, the guy goes on the field last night on Monday Night Football, and then Bobby Wagner from the Rams steps over and just makes just an absolutely decleating tackle on a dude with no pads on or anything like that. Now, listen, this guy's out there in Bobby Wagner's sort of office, so I guess he gets what's coming to him. But the whole thing's strange. The smoke coming off the guy. But how much does the Wagner hit probably hurt here? I mean, I've been kind of hit very lightly on the sideline a couple times by players. When you're not wearing pads and they are, you really, really, really feel it. I'm always amazed when the sideline reporters get hit and they just sort of dust it off and shake themselves off as quickly as they did. But Wagner last night laid the lumber on a clean tackle. I don't know how many folks intruding onto the playing surface you see anytime soon. So, Bobby, we'll give you a golden shoe for today. Lousy, stinking Gators. We believe that a good Georgia fan is a Gator hater first and foremost. In 5,017 days, dogs, that's how long they've watched Florida be in a national title drought, a number that we think continues for a long time there as well. And Eddie the Blind Squirrel loves it. Gator hater countdown, now 25 days away from Georgia being in Jacksonville to beat up on those lousy, stinking Gators. We love that. We'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And by the way, speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, as I pull away from the microphone here for a couple seconds, don't forget, I got the Lousy Stinking Gators t-shirt right here in my hand, and you can go to DawgNation.com right at the top of the page, and you can get your own version of this Lousy Stinking Gators t-shirt there as well. You can also get the Eddie the Blind Squirrel t-shirt. You want to show your Gator hater credentials? It's getting about that time to do that, folks. We've had our attention on a lot of different things here as of late, but pretty soon it's going to be about time to get focused on the biggest rival of them all for Georgia. That's the Lousy Stinking Gators. So Eddie the Blind Squirrel, Lousy Stinking Gators t-shirt. These Gators need to know just how lousy and stinking they are. And so that's what this great merchandise gives you a chance to do. So DawgNation.com for more on that. All right, so let's get your comments here. And I guess I should give the catchphrase. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that today. I'm going to go to YouTube first. We'll take some comments there, and then we'll just see how everybody's doing and what's on folks' mind and whatever you want to do. Let's do it now. By the way, Darius Smith Sr. giving you the two fingers in the air. I like that. Going for 2 and 22. You love that. And, of course, Darius Smith, a big part of that there, too. That's awesome. That's awesome. Dimitri Sullivan says, we spent all offseason praising the UGA tight end room, but you want to utilize one guy. Come on, man. Big O just as useful. I love you, Dimitri, and I love Darnell Washington, but Darnell Washington's not the same category of Brock Bowers. He's not. And we said this at the time. You can go back and listen to us all offseason long, that there is this misunderstanding of what Georgia has with Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is a player on par with any wide receiver in the country, and Georgia needs to use him that way. And I like Darnell Washington. I think that Darnell Washington should have a larger role than he probably does, but that role should not come at the expense of Brock Bowers. It just shouldn't. It is a grotesque misunderstanding of what you have. Georgia has one of the 5 or 10 most dynamic playmakers in the entire country with Bowers, and he's the only player on the offense who comes close to being that kind of player. And Dimitri, I think you're a great commenter, but you can't put Darnell Washington and Brock Bowers and compare them as equals. You can't do that. You can certainly say that Darnell also should be used more effectively than he has been, but not at the expense of Brock Bowers. Darnell's good, but he's not the kind of player that Brock Bowers is, one of the truly best players in the entire country. Is that Belize the Ruler says it's a team sport. It's not just the Brock Bowers show. You need more than one player. It's totally fine. But when you get into a bind, you got to lean on who your best is. And being able to lean on who your best is requires understanding just how much better that guy is in terms of continually making plays for. He's got like 19 touchdowns over the course of the last, 20 games? I think I'm right about that. Like, those numbers speak for themselves. I don't have the obligation to prove myself in this point. The stats make it completely clear. They make it obvious. It is not up for discussion. Let's see what else. Dimitri Sullivan says that's where we disagree. He says that's where we disagree. The only thing that Brock has over him is speed. I think you got to understand, though, just how much. And listen, Georgia's got a lot of good players on offense. They do. You're not going to hear me say a bad word about any of them. But for the positions they play, I don't know how many guys you would say on the Georgia offense really bring the speed quotient to the table. That's one of the things that makes Bowers so valuable, because he does have that speed that allows him to create the separation. Like, that is part of what makes him so valuable. And I said before, like, the number of touchdowns that he scores is the only proof that you need on this. It's the only thing. It's the only thing that matters. Justin Wolf says Bowers is top 5, if not number 1. I agree, though. But when Bowers is doing good, Darnell should get more looks. That's where I'm right there with you. So this is one of those things that Georgia just doesn't seem to value the way that I think we all do, or at least that I do. But I do think you have to know what you have. And I would look at a guy like Bowers saying he's got 5 catches, but I believe the Georgia offense would be better if he had 10. I truly believe that. And I know those catches have to come at the expense of someone else. And I'm totally fine with that. I think 10 touches for Brock Bowers gets more for the Georgia offense than what you got on Saturday. But at the same time, I'm totally fine with saying, okay, well, if Darnell's getting 2 or 3 catches, how does that become 5? That's a guy right now who I think has proven to be worthy of more than he's getting. I'm not disputing that. The only dispute I'm going to give is the fact that Darnell and Bowers being mentioned in the same sentence, and all the discussion of how loaded the Georgia tight end room is, even if it is, has obscured the fact that Georgia's got a special, truly elite talent. As it stands right now, I would say that the only player I believe that projects as a first-round pick on this Georgia offense right now is Bowers. That's a guy you got to use. And that doesn't mean that you can't use Washington more, but I don't put Washington in the same category as Bowers. I don't. Antoine Sampson says Bowers is just faster, but use Blaylock and Washington more, and you'll see the impact of the offense more. You can give Bowers a slight more, but those other 2 need reps. I'm fine with that too, Antoine. I don't disagree with what you're saying either, that if you're making a list of who are the guys you can trust and who are the guys you can depend on, who are the guys that just sort of get it done, you want to put Blaylock in that conversation, I think that's worthy. You want to say Washington's in that combination, what he did on Saturday down near the red zone, I think that's worthy. I want to see him get some touchdowns. I've already said this. I said this a couple of weeks ago that the numbers that Washington was on pace to put up was going to put him in that sort of 500 yards receiving type range. That's about where like a Jermaine Burton or a A.D. Mitchell would have been for Georgia a year ago. But the one thing he wasn't quite getting enough of were those touchdown opportunities. They threw to him in the end zone against Samford, and it just was a throw that Stetson would have liked to have had back. But you got to do that more. I want to see him get touchdowns. I do. I think he's a weapon down there. And I think they're going to have to trust the idea that he may not create the same kind of separation that a faster player creates, but his strength gives him a chance, kind of almost like a basketball player, to sort of post up and get the ball right there. But if you want to make Blaylock be part of that, that's fine. Now, here's what we also know. If you're saying more for Blaylock, more for Washington, I would say way more for Bowers, then you're also saying less for other guys there too. And that's just kind of the nature of the way the game is played. Let's see what else. Jeremy Little says, I don't know why anybody would be offended by using Bowers more. They all want to win. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's important to just understand like what we're all seeing or what is happening that we should be seeing. Redbeard says it's a late post BA, but Missouri and Kent State put 8 men in the box on defense, and the Dogs' offense was very slow to react and conquer. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of been the story, right? And now in the case of Missouri, they also played like really aggressive man there for a while too, and whether it be throwing the ball to punish a running, kind of a run-oriented box, or really gashing those rushing plays at a time in which they're kind of playing like zero coverage, something like. I mean, whatever it is, you just want to be able to throw the left hand punch, the right hand punch. I guess I did the punches opposite. You just want to be able to throw the left handed punch, the right handed punch, and that's what Georgia's kind of a work in progress on right now. Pretty clearly this doesn't seem to be the same offense that it looked like against Oregon, against South Carolina, but that's what this Auburn game on Saturday is kind of about there too. Thomas Dew says that Brian Harsin gets fired at Auburn, lame duck coach there. Yeah, if they lose on Saturday, I believe he's going to get fired. I do. Jordan Harris says, what about A.D. Mitchell coming back? So Kirby Smart said yesterday that he's closer than he has been. And that's a guy that, look, they miss A.D. Mitchell right now. A.D. Mitchell's good. They miss A.D. Mitchell. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that, I think he's in a lot of ways kind of separated himself within the category of players that we think of exclusively as wide receivers. I think that's the case. And I thought that Connor brought up an interesting point earlier, and I wasn't quite aware of this, that Brock played so many more snaps than Darnell did on Saturday. it sort of makes me wonder, okay, does that mean that when Darnell's coming off the field, they're going 3 receivers and using Brock as tight end? Is that what they're doing there? I honestly don't know. I'm assuming that might be. And it kind of makes me wonder, well, okay, does that mean that what if you just use Bowers as your slot receiver there and let Darnell play the tight end role? Maybe that's a way of getting him on the field more. I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, Antoine also asking about A.D. Mitchell. So, it seems like he's been day-to-day for a few weeks. Unfortunately, this kind of happens with some of these Georgia injuries sometimes. But Smart said he almost played last Saturday and closer now than he's been. So that gives you a little bit of a hopeful tone there. Maybe that's the case. Christy says she's confused. Listen, Christy, I spend most of my life confused, unfortunately. Jeremy Little says we bring the 11 best, not the best 11. That's something that Kirby said the other day, I think. And I have to admit, I'm a little bit confused by that. I'm not quite so sure which is the best. Is it better to have the best 11 or the 11 best? I'm not quite so sure which is the best version of that, but I did hear Kirby say that. Ryland Dale says, what's your score prediction, assuming that Robbie Ashford starts over Finley? I'm assuming 31-14 or somewhere around there. The 29.5 point spread's a little high for me. 29.5 feels a little high for me right now, too. I do think that Georgia will play better, I think. But 29.5 points is a lot of points. A lot of points. And I was pretty confident laying that number last week against Missouri when it was like in that 28-29 range. Probably a little less confident right now. That's just a lot of points. I actually kind of like Robbie Ashford. And I don't know, it's sort of weird. Like I remember when he was in high school, Hoover, and I sort of thought he was going to be a little bit more of a prospect than he kind of ultimately got treated as. So there's a part of me, I mean, obviously not rooting for him on Saturday, but I'm just sort of glad to see him doing well. I thought he was a pretty good quarterback in high school. Yeah, he and Pickens run the same team at the same time there at Hoover. All right, let me go to Facebook here for a moment. On Facebook. And of course, Ashford had been at Oregon before coming back over to Auburn. And I think a lot of folks kind of thought when he was brought here, he was sort of brought here as kind of like by here I mean the SEC, sort of like a number 3 type quarterback. But the truth is it seems like he was kind of ahead of Calzada all summer long. Wayne Kirkland says UGA will play better, but take the 29 points and make some money. Yeah, 29 points is kind of a lot. I do. I'm not saying I won't talk myself into taking it, but that's kind of a lot. I saw last year Georgia was a 15-point favorite against Auburn, the highest they'd ever been favored in the history of the series, which kind of most spread data dates back to, like, say, 1977. That's how long people have been keeping track of that. Georgia had never been higher than a 15-point favorite last year when they were, and a year later that spread's essentially doubled there too. I think it shows you how quickly Auburn is regressing as a program. Auburn's really bad. And they're not quit bad because they didn't quit the game on Saturday against LSU. They didn't quit in the game. They were up and leading. But we said going into the Penn State game that what everybody be aware of on the other side of that is just how bad Auburn is. And I think that's kind of been proven to be true. You know, lucky to beat Missouri. Didn't get quite so lucky against LSU. This is a bad football team. And so, you know, that's just sort of what it is. They're not quit bad. They haven't quit on anybody yet, but they might. Brandon Griffin also mentioning, Dylan Bell at wide receiver, Levante Peterson too. Yeah, Bell had a couple of important catches for Georgia. Barry Watkins, by the way, lives in Auburn. He says, all these Tigers talking a lot of smack this week. I'm secretly recording every one of them. My theory on this is that some fan bases know they have to do their talking before the game because they have no chance to talk after the game. And let's face it, these are SEC fans. They're going to want to talk some smack to somebody about something. So that's kind of what this is that some of the loudest trash talk comes from teams that have no chance of winning because if they don't do it now, they don't get to do it. So, Barry, our prayers to you for living there in enemy territory, and I hope that goes okay for you. Peyton Calhoun says Washington's the highest graded tight end in the nation. There's a lot more that goes into the position and receiving stats. Based on that and size alone, Washington go first round. I don't care a rip about what Pro Football Focus grades him as. That doesn't mean anything to me whatsoever. But he is, I mean, I also am of the belief that he is a very valuable player to Georgia beyond beyond just the number of catches he's getting. He's clearly an elite dominant blocker. He is clearly an elite dominant blocker. And there are people who say because of that he should get more touches as a reward for that. I don't disagree with that. I don't. But when you really need somebody to move the football for you, there is zero doubt who is magnitudes better at doing that for Georgia than anybody else in this offense. Zero doubt about that. Let's see what else. Over in the Facebook side. EB Senior saying that Mahomes not showing McCole Hardman enough love right now. I haven't really watched the Chiefs a ton, so I didn't know that, but we hope that changes. Matt Rukavina giving you the I like driving in my truck, Auburn, and you know how to finish the rest of that line. That's pretty funny stuff from Matt Rukavina there. Brandon Griffin says, I want to see Arian Smith stay healthy. Yeah, that's another guy. If you say, hey, the valuable commodity that Bowers has is his speed, a guy like Arian Smith is the other guy. Now, C.J. Smith one day can have some of this too, but C.J. just got here. But Arian Smith, when healthy, has shown that speed that, I still have this intuition. I said this last year. It didn't quite come true because he got hurt again. But I just sort of have this picture in my mind of Arian Smith making a very big, deep down-the-field catch for Georgia. I just do. May not be a great season, but it could be a great moment for sure. Johnny Rugg says that Georgia can cover against Auburn if you get 2 turnovers. Maybe that's the case. Let's see what else. What else is going on here? Kent Dagestani says we heard criticism of the offensive line, the defensive line, receivers, and coaching, but no criticism of Stetson. The overthrows, accuracy issues, not recognizing blitzes, and the weak throws. Yardage is not the only thing that matters. Stet has to get better. I think that's probably true. I do. I don't think Saturday was a referendum on Bennett one way or another. But certainly not avoiding the topic. He needs to be better than he was. I don't think there's any doubt of that. I think the one thing that is a non-starter for me, though, is this thought of, well, Stetson Bennett doesn't play better than he did on Saturday, then ... If Stetson Bennett doesn't play better on Saturday, then nothing. Like, it is not even a consideration of, oh, well, maybe they'll just put Carson back in, because that's just not a discussion right now. It's not a relevant topic within the Georgia sphere. Now, you can always sort of fan the flames of hysteria by trying to get people to think that way and talk that way. And, there's always going to be, people that want to, kind of, grab that low-hanging fruit. But that is not in any way a relevant issue related to Georgia. It's not on anybody's radar. Bennett needs to be better than he was on Saturday, but there is no but to that sentence. There is no next thing on that sentence. That is just what it is. And the fact that he did bounce back and have a better statistical day overall does mean something. Now you're going to say, well, some of those passing yards may have been a little empty. Maybe that's the case in a day otherwise that wasn't great for him. And Kirby Smart acknowledged this. Kirby Smart said after the game it wasn't a great day for Bennett. And I'll admit that going back and kind of reconsidering the game is probably a little worse for Bennett than maybe I gave it credence to in the early going. But, we're certainly not going to, absolve anybody from any necessary criticism. I don't think that Bennett's issues, whatever they may have been, were the most significant issues for Georgia in the game. I don't. Johnny Ruggs, thanks for the kind words. He lives here in New Jersey. Johnny, I appreciate that. Glad to have you checking in from the Garden State today. That's awesome. Barry Watkins also likes to see more Dylan Bell. That's a name worth considering. I thought Dylan as a true freshman has looked really pretty good, and Terrence Edwards kind of called his shot on that. Randy Hall about Friday high school football. East Coweta going to Carrollton. 2 really good quarterbacks in that game. I'm excited about that. Stafford Square Dog says, does Stetson have pictures of Kirby or something? What Stetson has is a national championship trophy. That's what Stetson has. JP says Tennessee's best win arguably just lost to Tech, and when Tennessee played the team they were down their starting quarterback and half the offensive line. He says Florida's this close to being 1-4. Tennessee has yet to play an SEC road game either. Their defense is horrible. They made Arkansas look like not Arkansas. Anthony Richardson looked like a great passer on the road. Yeah, like I said, I think that Tennessee is a good team. I think they may go 10-2. They may go 9-3. Good team, but I'm not greatly upgrading my opinion of Tennessee based on what they've done thus far this season. And it sounds like JP is, or not JP, but the commenters saying kind of the same thing there. That it's been okay. It's been pretty good, but the game with Florida wasn't as good as it was supposed to be. And the game with Pitt, you won on the road, but that's kind of what they're expected to do. That, if anything, Tennessee's actually probably underperformed compared to expectations, at least a little bit thus far this year. Charles Womack said, love watching the Missouri defensive back go flying after hitting Darnell on the catch. That gives you an idea of just how physically imposing Darnell is. Because a moment like that, Darnell kind of has the look of what you call a defenseless receiver. His hands are up, his eyes on the football. He's as unprotected as you can ever be, and the defensive player gets his free shot on him right there, and you just can't move him. You just can't move him. It is amazing how physically imposing he is. AU says Tennessee is being rebuilt brick by brick, which is obviously a funny jab at the old Butch Jones era. But I'll tell you this. They are building something that kind of matters. I think it's not happening as quick as maybe, some people kind of suggest it is. People just don't have very long memories. All they see is Tennessee's record. Oh my gosh, Tennessee's good. But the truth is, Tennessee was expected to be undefeated this portion of the season. Nothing has happened that's unsurprising at all for Tennessee. They were expected to be undefeated. So while I'm not going to lose my mind about what they've accomplished at this point in time, when you look at what's happened thus far this year, what happened a year ago, the fact of the matter is Josh Heupel has proven to be a better coach than I probably thought he would have been at the time. And for all the people who kind of made fun of Tennessee when Jeremy Pruitt fell apart and kind of wanted to go back and look at, well, I guess these Tennessee folks wish they had Greg Schiano right now. No, they don't. Schiano was, losing by 40 points to Ohio State on Saturday and trying to fight the coach. Greg Schiano is an embarrassment. And Josh Heupel right now has Tennessee in a far better position here in the SEC than I think that Schiano ever would have had any hope of being able to do. So while I don't think that Tennessee is an elite team, I don't think they're among the national elite. They're not one of the 10 best teams in the country, I don't believe. I think that what Josh Heupel is building, I think you got to get some credit for that. I do. BA's listening face says part of Stetson Bennett's issues were that the pocket caved in half a second due to our guards wearing roller skates. I think on Saturday, while Stetson Bennett should not be absolved from criticism, I do believe the issues with the offensive line were the most significant issue for Georgia on that day, I believe. Terry says that Heupel may be the best Tennessee coach since Philip Fulmer. I'd say that's probably true. Certainly what he's doing right now. Look, when Pruitt left, Tennessee had 1 million guys transfer. 1 million guys transfer. They were bad defensively, like one of our commenters said a moment ago. But the fact they've been not the worst defense in the country, even though they've had major personnel issues on that side of the ball, he probably should get some credit for even just sort of holding that together. Pretty clearly he's a sharp offensive mind. We kind of already knew that. But for even holding it together defensively, they probably get a little bit of credit. And here's what's weird, is that I thought that Josh Heupel as a head coach at UCF was kind of only above average. I didn't think that he was doing anything all that great there. He probably wasn't recruiting UCF as well as Gus Malzahn is right now. I thought he was just kind of only okay. He's actually been a better coach at Tennessee than he was at UCF, and I think that's kind of interesting given the challenges. Herb Hamilton says, seems like a lot of recruits avoid big programs because they won't get early playing time, but Kirby's doing a pretty good job of giving young players a chance to play. Yeah, I think that's an important point, Herb, and it kind of dovetails back to what we were saying before about, well, so-and-so's got to have more touches, and this guy's got to have more touches. But part of the reason that some players don't get as many touches as we think they should get is because Kirby is finding a way to get more guys involved. A guy like Dylan Bell is playing a pretty good bit and really playing pretty well given the opportunity that he's been provided. And Kirby has kind of always tried to strike that balance and probably leaning more in the direction of creating a little bit of parity with playing time when he can, and that for him has kind of worked pretty well. Georgia has not had A lot of folks thought Georgia was going to have this exodus in the transfer portal last offseason, and it didn't occur. It didn't. That you've got a lot of guys, a lot of places who are looking to just bolt and go somewhere else. And for better or worse, you haven't had a ton of that at Georgia, and you have to assume that Kirby's doing something right to prevent that from happening. Randy Hall says, great that Gilbert traveled with team, shows that Kirby cares about the person and not the immediate production. Benefits will be seen in the future. Randy, I think that's such an important point. And I've had a lot of private conversation with a lot of people related to Gilbert just because I like him. I just like Gilbert. I just want him to be good because I like him. And I've had a lot of people who know this situation pretty well tell me in the privacy of a, off-the-record conversation that in this particular case, that is exactly what Georgia's doing. That the only thing that Georgia is worried about with Gilbert right now is getting him happier and healthier and getting him sort of where he needs to be on a personal journey standpoint. And, we just talked about two very good Georgia tight ends. So it's not like they're desperate for him to play. They'd like for him to play, but it's not like they're desperate for him to play or anything like that. But I do believe they are fully committed to making him the best version of himself that he can be, whether that includes playing football or not. And, I think that kind of stuff matters. I do. Like, Kirby is as, hard-driving a dude as you can ever get. And he's obviously a tenacious competitor. But, given the chance to, value winning over people, I don't think you see Kirby doing that. I really don't. I don't think you see moments in which, Kirby lets it be known that he doesn't really care about the players. He just cares about winning. The Gilbert example of this, I think, is the perfect one. Like I said, I've been told by people who kind of know that they're really working hard on his behalf for reasons that have nothing to do with football, whether he plays at Georgia or not. I think it's, kind of up in the air if he will play this season or not, because I think he's dealing with some significant challenges. But they took him to Missouri last week, not so he could learn the offense, but so he could be around people that love him, because you feed off of that. And I got to tell you, I'm really happy that Georgia does its business that way. Yes, I want Georgia to win. Of course I do. I think we all do. But I still like the idea that they do things that don't really have much to do with winning, that allow, make it a little bit easier path for guys to win at life. I do like that. I'm glad. Let's see what else. Jeremy Little says Stet's the guy until he proves that he can't be. Kirby's going to make that change himself if it becomes so. Yeah, I just don't think it's. I mean, Stetson Bennett is. I mean, Stetson Bennett's having a great year. He didn't play that great on Saturday, but I mean, he's having a remarkable year. I don't think he's the best quarterback in the country, but I think that he is giving Georgia a lot from the quarterback position, and that's just what it is. Now, I think they should run him more. Now, I think when you're having struggles with your offensive line, when you're having a hard time getting your traditional rushing attack going, quarterback runs are almost always the most efficient play that any offense can provide if it's capable of showcasing a running quarterback. And from that standpoint, they ought to run Stetson more than they do. I believe that. Jonathan Aaron says, besides Harsin, who else do you think around the country's on the hot seat? Do you think your old friends Urban and Mullen will get one of the openings? It's really interesting to me, Jonathan, just how much supposed hot seat coaches are getting fired so quickly now. And I guess I'm assuming that the early signing period must have something to do with this, I guess. But, Nebraska fired Scott Frost a few weeks ago, knowing that if they had just waited until right now to fire him, they could have saved $7 million of buyout money. But they didn't want to do that. They wanted to fire him right away. Wisconsin's not a very good team. Had a bad game on Saturday, and boom, they just fired Paul Chryst just like that. So it's interesting how few hot seat type coaches are left to linger. Harsin, I would say, is in the most precarious spot here right now because of all the guys we've already seen get fired. I don't know how much you can hire Urban Meyer right now. This thing in Jacksonville really tarnished his reputation. And I guess it's a little easier to go back and work on TV again. But I don't know how many people feel all that good about hiring Meyer right now. Maybe I'm wrong about this and they'll just boom and hire him. I'm not quite so sure it's that easy for him right now because the entire ordeal in Jacksonville, not just, was just a lot of stuff about Urban where it's like his reputation really took a knot during his time in Jacksonville. And I think it's caused some people to reconsider a lot of the things that's happened to him while he was a college coach. And then as far as the Dan Mullen thing goes, I mean, I think Mullen's going to have opportunities, but I'm not quite so sure how much he wants to just kind of rush back into it. I mean, maybe he does, but like in a place like Georgia Tech, I don't think a place like Tech could afford to hire a guy like Dan Mullen. And so I don't really know what kind of job that leaves him. I think at this point he wants a certain amount of money to come back and coach. And maybe some program's willing to pay that, maybe they're not. Who else is in the hot seat, though? I mean, I will tell you this. I don't think he's in the hot seat. I don't. But some of the chatter around Jimbo at Texas A&M is getting kind of interesting. What if they get beat 40-0 on Saturday, which they very easily could, even with Jalen Milroe playing quarterback? What happens then? I do not believe A&M. It'd just be too embarrassing to ever try to move on from Jimbo right now. And I've said this openly. Y'all know that I have touted for Fisher as a good coach. If the trajectory that's on right now continues, then I'm forced to sit here and take the L on that. I just am forced to. Like, he does not need to lose by 1,000,000 points on Saturday. He just does not. And I think Alabama, even with a backup quarterback, maybe even especially because it's a backup quarterback, may be motivated to do that because they got beat last year. They want to kind of rally around the team. No better way to do that than to kind of show folks that you don't need your Heisman Trophy winner to come out and play great. This could be a tough spot for Jimbo. And I said before, I don't believe he's in the hot seat because I don't think whether you financially could move on from him or not, because you have to pay him the whole deal. It's like $90 million. I don't even think from a face-saving standpoint you could do it. But my gosh, there is some really interesting chatter coming out of A&M about this right now. Let's see what else. Rick Sanchez says Georgia doesn't get a mulligan for Missouri. Kent State was the mulligan. So I get that. And there's a lot of Georgia fans who are ready to see Georgia play better. I totally understand that. Zebulon Owen says that college football has had a lot of attrition since week 0. He says, I love the chaos. Sometimes you have to embrace the suck to be glorious, which is that's a Marine phrase. Embrace the suck. Is that a Marine phrase? I think that's from the Marines. I think there is a part of that that's really true. Like right now, we don't know anything. And for those of us who just love college football, we want to know. We want to know who the 4 best teams are. We want to know kind of, what the paths are. And as it stands right now, we kind of don't know. Like Georgia kind of teeters on the brink here of, hey, maybe this is the best team in the country, which we sort of said they would be, or at least, after a couple of weeks, we're sort of thinking they were. Or maybe this is, a team that kind of falls back towards the pack a little bit, which other folks kind of said they would be. Same thing for Alabama there as well. I mean, there's a chance that, it's weird how much better some Alabama fans think their team is because Georgia played bad on Saturday when obviously those 2 points are actually unrelated. Like, there's a chance that Alabama ends up not being national elite. We're going to see Ohio State play some games that matter coming up too. The team that I think is really interesting right now is Penn State. I think that Penn State is, I think it's Penn State, Michigan next week. You'll have Penn State, Ohio State eventually. I'm not quite sure when that is in the schedule. We're about to learn a lot more about the Big Ten coming up. For Clemson, their schedule gets way easier now after playing NC State and Wake Forest in back-to-back weeks. But do you feel like you know what Clemson is? I mean, all of a sudden now we're sure they're good. I don't quite know how that is. I don't quite know how that could be. That there's still a lot of mystery here. And much the same way we may eventually find out, well, I guess Georgia wasn't elite after all. We could absolutely find that about anybody else at any given moment there as well. It is a chaotic scene here for the moment. And it's going to take a very rigorous run through October to figure some of that out. Zebulon Owen says he thinks that Penn State should be in the top 5. I believe they'd be in my top 5 right now. I do. Jeremy Little calling for one of the Mississippi schools to clip Bama. That's an interesting prediction. Jonathan Aaron says, let's just say Urban does get hired somewhere else. How long before he has another hell scare? And I think Jonathan's kind of pointing to the fact that there's a lot of that sort of manufactured drama with Urban. People don't like that. People do not like that. Some of y'all are very funny. Brandon Griffin says, what's the over-under on A&M players entering the transfer portal? Yeah, I mean, that could be messy, too. I saw where, all the SMU players are supposedly entering the transfer portal. It's a weird time, man. Weird time. JP and the subject of Tyron Ingram Dawkins. I know there's been a lot of curiosity on that right now. I don't have too much for you on that right now. Paige Holloway says it's too early to know about any of this stuff. Give it time, we'll find out. And Paige is right about that. It's all got to just kind of play out before our eyes. That's what we love about college football. Now, that's not going to stop us from debating it. We're going to, have takes and opinions and all that kind of stuff, but the actual information takes a while to be revealed, and that's why we love this sport, man. It's crazy and as messed up as it is, we just love it. Charles Womack says, I think the early signing periods affected the early firings. I think so too. And this is one of those things that, Georgia really benefited from. When they moved on from Richt and hired Kirby, the signing period that year wasn't until February. The first early signing period wasn't until the class of 2018. And it enabled Kirby to do a lot of stuff that he otherwise might not be able to do. Like, for instance, not just the recruiting stuff, and Georgia probably had the best recruiting class ever for a head coach that never coached a game. That's probably a designation I would have given that 2016 class for Georgia. Not all the guys ended up being great players for Georgia, but it was not a bust of a class, and, Kirby was able to put it together. But the other thing, too, was he was able to, secure Sam Pittman as his offensive line coach and then build a coaching staff on that side of the ball kind of around that. He was able to make, big hires, the guy like Mel Tucker and, some of the guys that he brought in. Had there been an early signing period in place in 2016, I don't know that the beginning of the Smart era would have gone as smoothly as it did. So for as good a coach as Smart is, like everybody else who's successful, there is at least a little bit of luck that he benefited from. And the calendar being different then than it is now was a little bit of a lucky break for both him and Georgia way back in 2016. I just sort of think that's true. And I do think for teams that want to fire their coach, the presence of the early signing period just makes it really, really tough to do that. I think that college football needs to clean up its calendar. I think the early signing period is a failed experiment. I think they tried it. Maybe they had good reasons for wanting to. It's obvious that it hasn't worked. They wanted to reduce the amount of drama related to recruiting, and all they've done is move the drama up earlier in the calendar. I'd be in favor of there only being a signing day in February. I'd be in favor of just going back to the way that things used to be. But either way, the December signing period is just not working. Whatever the things they thought it would accomplish, it hasn't accomplished them, and it's had all kinds of unintended consequences that's actually sort of made the day-to-day operation of the sport, I believe, worse. And this is before you kind of get into the fact that, you add new players before you lose your old players. If you think about the way in which the calendar kind of operates, that's backwards too. You shouldn't have signing day until after NFL draft declare day. It's just all in the wrong order. And I think it could be fixed. I believe it eventually probably will be fixed, but I'm not quite sure how soon that happens. Stafford Square Dog says the quarterback's supposed to put the team in the best plays, pre-snap read, and adjust. JP was saying we didn't check into those plays against the blitz. It's on the quarterback to do it. Yeah, maybe that's the case. I honestly don't know. Maybe that's the case. Cam Hasty says, I could be wrong, but I don't believe a quarterback is capable of knowing the angle of a blitz beforehand. If offenses knew what angles the defense would blitz from, they'd score every play. So here's the one thing that I do think is probably true across the board. I think we greatly exaggerate the in-game decision-making that any quarterback is making. I think the quarterbacks kind of like the thought of, I'm choosing between 4 and 5 reads. But have you ever had somebody ask you a question, like say you got a kid in the back seat, when you're trying to change lanes of traffic? You can't process those things all simultaneously. And football's the same way. It's we act like quarterbacks are supercomputers, processing all of this. They're clearly changing plays at the line. They're clearly making a decision where to pass the football. But I think generally speaking, even for the best and the smartest quarterbacks, I think we greatly exaggerate what they are thinking about in the midst of a play. I just do. Let's see what else. Lucy Bowers-Boykin says, and we got to get ready to go, I remember when signing day in February was fun and suspenseful. Yeah, I do too. I loved it. Plus, the other thing is, boy, it's really late. We got to go. The other thing is, it's do we have to ruin Christmas with recruiting? I mean, it just feels like, can we not have Christmas? It's like the college football calendar just sort of takes over everything, which I love college football. But if you moved it back to February, you could sort of feel like Christmas was Christmas right before the college football playoff begins. Ken Holcomb also says, I think that Monken should call more design run plays for Bennett in certain situations. He's proven he can get it done with his legs and quickness and basically do his thing and then slide for the first down. Yeah. Like one of the things that make quarterback runs so valuable is the defense doesn't necessarily know what's coming. Whereas like traditional runs, oftentimes they're coming in fairly predictable moments, which gives the defense just a better chance of stopping it. But quarterback runs are back-breaking plays for the opposing defense oftentimes because they don't always come in predictable moments. One of the reasons why on a per-play basis, a quarterback run is about the most efficient thing you can do. Now, you can't just line up and do it over and over again. Eventually, that in itself becomes predictable. But a well-placed quarterback run is just really hard to stop. And one of the things that made Saturday different was it was the first game all season which Bennett did not have a rushing touchdown. And I think you've got to try to find a way to get as many of those for him as you can. Clarence Dawson says one more comment. Yeah, I know it. I like taking comments, but boy, it's gotten late. It's gotten late. So let's go. Good stuff. Bill says this is a nice escape from the stuff going on in Washington, D.C. That's what we exist to be. We don't talk about that kind of stuff. You're free to think whatever you want to about any of that kind of stuff. It's not any of my business. If we were having lunch, maybe we'd talk about it. But if we're going to do this, I'm going to come in here. I'm going to do my job every day, which is to help you take your mind off whatever may be going on in your world, whether it be related to politics or related to anything else. That is what we're going to do around here. But I will tell you who does talk about that kind of stuff. It's our friends at the AJC. That's their job. I have a different job. They have the job of covering all that. So if you want to know what's going on in your world, including last night, by the way, a very disappointing performance from the Braves down in Miami. And I guess the thought is Jake Odorizzi's pitching tonight, which is a little bit of a tricky thing. So the Braves trying to clinch the division, and hopefully they don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be. But you can check that out online, ajc.com, for a lot more on that. And, of course, we are getting ready for an election. They're covering that there, too. So ajc.com for more on that. Our friends at R.S. Andrews, one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. Your water heater goes out. In many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day. But you've got to find them online at rsandrews.com. You have a great day. We will see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.